He wakes up in the middle of the night. He feels sick. The hotel room is stifling. His wife and daughter are lying beside him. He reaches toward his daughter and realizes she is not moving. Her body is cold. Her skin is blue. A few minutes later, the police receive a phone call. Officers arrive at a hotel room and find a mother and her 8-year-old daughter dead. No signs of violence. No clear cause of death. At first, everyone assumes it was poisoning, but sometime later, investigators will declare it was murder, and the main suspect is the man who first picked up the phone. But what if this case is not as simple as it seems? On the night of July 30th, 2013, Irena and Karel Rikli were peacefully asleep in their home in Karvina, Czech Republic, when the woman's phone rang. Half asleep, she first thought the ringtone was part of a dream, but when she opened her eyes and looked at the screen, she saw that it was her son, Petr Kramny, calling from Egypt, where he had been vacationing with his wife and daughter. She immediately understood that something was wrong, and that was exactly what she asked when she answered the phone. In a frightened, trembling voice, Petr said, Mom, I don't know what happened. Monica and Clara are dead." His mother told him to get help immediately, to run into the hallway, scream, knock on neighboring doors, anything to make someone come help him. A young woman from Poland was staying in the room next to the family. When Petr Kramny began pounding on her door in the middle of the night, she quickly threw on some clothes and opened it. In a shaking voice, Petr told her that his wife and daughter were unwell, not breathing, and that their skin was covered in dark spots. The woman followed him into the neighboring room. When she entered, the mother and daughter were lying on separate beds. Near the balcony door lay the woman. Her posture looked relatively natural, her arms stretched along her body. On the second bed against the wall, the little girl lay with her arms spread out to the sides. Neither reacted to anything. On the floor between the beds lay a bottle of Coca-Cola. About a third of the liquid remained inside, and beneath it was a dark puddle, apparently from the spilled drink. After seeing this scene, the woman ran downstairs to notify the hotel staff. Together with an employee, she returned to the room. By then, after the initial shock had faded, she noticed a horrible smell in the room, something rotten and decayed. Petr was sitting on the bed where the woman's body lay. He seemed focused and was holding insurance documents that travel agencies provide to tourists. Apparently, he had already contacted the agency because their representative would arrive at the hotel later. The doctor, however, did not arrive for another hour and a half. When he finally came, he took Petr into the Polish woman's room. There, Peter asked for something to drink, finished the remaining water from her bottle, and began coughing violently and painfully. He looked as if he was about to vomit, but nothing came out. When the travel agency representative arrived, Petr was sitting on the Polish woman's bed, crying hysterically, speaking incoherently, completely devastated. Naturally, she asked what had happened. The man replied, "I think we were all poisoned." The hotel doctor examined the bodies but could not determine the cause of death. He found no signs of violence such as stab wounds, strangulation marks, or broken bones. He concluded that it was poisoning and ordered Petr to undergo gastric lavage. Mother tried calling son back to find out what had happened, but an unfamiliar woman answered and explained that Petr was very ill and was being taken to the hospital for stomach pumping. Once he recovered, he would call her back. Petr was indeed taken to the hospital, where doctors pumped his stomach, only to discover it was completely empty. He had been vomiting so severely that no food remained. Meanwhile, within 3 or 4 hours, news of the incident spread throughout the hotel. Since guests knew almost nothing, rumors circulated that the victims had been poisoned, and when people learned that a little girl had died, everyone became cautious about the food. But people's imaginations soon went further, and rumors began spreading that a cleaner had murdered the mother and daughter, that they had been shot or even burned alive. Everyone waited to hear what would happen next, but no information came. When doctors finally allowed investigators to speak with Petr, he explained that he, his 36-year-old wife Monica, and their 8-year-old daughter Clara had spent almost the entire previous day in their room because they were feeling ill. All three had suffered from vomiting and diarrhea, but husband's symptoms were the worst. By evening, they tried to lie down and sleep, but Petr still felt terrible. He repeatedly went to the bathroom. Between 9 and 10 p.m., Petr remembered the time because loud music was still playing in the hotel. He took 3 bottles and went to get water. As he opened the door, he removed the keycard, causing all the electricity in the room to shut off. He filled the bottles at a water dispenser and returned. The entire trip took no more than 7 minutes. He inserted the keycard back into the slot. The lights and air conditioning immediately came back on. When he entered the room, he exchanged a few words with his wife, and from that very moment, the last time he saw her alive, until the moment he discovered them both dead, he never left the room again, and no one else entered it. Petter added that he had been lying mostly near his daughter's feet. Half asleep, the little girl mumbled deliriously, "Grandpa, will you buy me some ice cream?" Petter replied, "Of course I will. Please go to sleep already. Morning will come soon. Please sleep. I feel awful." Closer to 4 in the morning, he noticed that his daughter was pressing tightly against him. He tried to gently move her away, but she did not move at all, and her skin felt ice cold. Petter turned on the light and saw that she was covered in dark blotches. She was completely blue. The father immediately tried to resuscitate her and shouted for his wife to wake up, yelling that something was wrong. Monica was lying with her back turned toward her husband and daughter and did not respond. Petter slapped her on the back to wake her. She did not move. He rushed to her, turned her over, and saw that his wife's eyes were open. He attempted CPR and mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but it did not work. By then, they had already been dead for quite some time. After Petter was discharged from the hospital, the hotel staff, seeing his condition, feared he might harm himself. They asked a young Czech entertainer working at the hotel to try distracting him as much as possible. The entertainer had often seen Petter and his family around the hotel during previous days and noticed a dramatic change in him. It was as if his soul had been removed, leaving behind only a shell. Petter spent most of his time sitting in the lobby or walking alone by the sea. He cried bitterly. It was painful to watch. The sedatives he took every 3 hours eased his suffering slightly. This was not how he had imagined their long-awaited family vacation. From that moment on, the sea would always mean pain and death to Petter. The Kramnys were a typical middle-class family from the small mining town of Karviná, Czech Republic. Petter and Monica married in 2007, when their daughter Klara was already 2 years old. In fact, they had known each other for much longer. Friends considered Petter and Monica a good couple, although they had very different personalities and temperaments. Monica was outgoing, cheerful, lively, and loved parties and gatherings with friends. She was very open and shared everything with her close girlfriends. Man, by contrast, was remembered as reserved, quiet, and soft-spoken. At the same time, everyone described him as extremely kind. The type of person people say wouldn't hurt a fly. His family meant everything to him. For 5 or 6 years of their marriage, Monica did not work and focused on raising their daughter. But once Klara grew older, Monica completed retraining courses and got a job as a caregiver at a nursing home. Her friends admired her decision. Not everyone could handle such difficult work, but for Monica it seemed natural and effortless. Her husband worked at the Hyundai automobile plant in the village of Noszowice. Being hard-working and responsible, he even worked weekends. The family was not wealthy, but Peter fully provided for his wife and daughter, often denying himself things in order to care for them. Then one day, Peter surprised his wife by telling her that she and their daughter would finally be able to vacation in Egypt. Monica was overjoyed and talked endlessly to her friends about how much she was looking forward to the trip. But unexpectedly, in 2013, Egypt experienced a new wave of protests that led to a military coup. Husband no longer wanted to go, but Monica did not want the money to go to waste and insisted on the trip. Their relatives and friends worried deeply about their safety, but all three safely arrived in Hurghada and checked into a very popular resort for Czech families, the Titanic Palace Hotel. Monica immediately sent photos to relatives and friends, writing that everything was wonderful and that Klara absolutely loved the water park. And now Monica and Klara were dead. After leaving the hospital, Petter was required to remain in Hurghada while authorities awaited the autopsy results. The first news would come a week later, but it would take much longer before anyone understood what had truly happened. Since Peter was expected to stay in Egypt for an unknown amount of time, he moved from the Titanic Palace Hotel to a simpler hotel in downtown Hurghada. Meanwhile, Czech news briefly reported the tragedy at the Egyptian resort, and the couple's friends could hardly believe that the victims were Monica and Clara. One of Monica's friends thought to call her phone number, but Peter answered instead. Through tears, he confirmed the deaths of Monica and Clara and struggled to explain what little he knew before the connection was lost. The news channels knew little else, but Czech media realized they had struck gold. One television station quickly sent a reporter and a cameraman to Egypt in hopes of interviewing Man. Both men were excited. They had never before been on a work trip abroad and intended to squeeze everything possible out of the story. They checked into the same hotel in downtown Hurghada where Peter had been staying. All three stood out among the other guests, and Peter immediately understood who they were. That very day, the journalists asked him for an interview. To their surprise, he agreed, even though in situations like this they usually expected rejection. As later events would show, speaking to the media would ultimately hurt Peter badly. By the time the journalists arrived, Peter spent all his time inside his hotel room. He went nowhere and spoke to no one, partly because he knew neither English nor Arabic. He called his parents and sister, complaining that he was completely alone there, trapped in what felt like a prison, even if only a hotel room prison. So when the Czech journalists arrived, he longed desperately to hear his native language and have real human contact. That was why he agreed to the interview, which aired almost immediately. Unexpectedly, viewers criticized him for not crying, despite the fact that he was heavily sedated with strong tranquilizers. Man then directly asked the reporter whether, in his opinion, he was showing enough emotion on camera. The reporter refused to judge, but during an evening interview, Man behaved much more emotionally and cried openly. Of course, the public learned about this because the reporter did not keep quiet and eagerly spread the story about Man's unusual behavior. In hindsight, Man probably should have locked himself away in the hotel and refused to let anyone near him, because the journalists harmed him far more than they helped. They were never his friends, and trusting them was a mistake. Around the same time, Czech police were not sitting idle. Regardless of what conclusions the Egyptian authorities might reach, Czech investigators were obligated to act independently. Without even waiting for the autopsy results, they opened a criminal case and began wiretapping the man's phone calls. Meanwhile, Hurghada police repeatedly summoned Peter for questioning. But to his astonishment, investigators were less interested in what had happened in the hotel room and more interested in details of the family's private life back in the Czech Republic. Apparently, police had discovered that Monica had maintained a secret social media account through which she communicated with men. Investigators therefore asked husband whether his wife had corresponded with anyone from Egypt, whether anyone had threatened her, and who exactly she had been in contact with. Since Man knew nothing about any of this, he later returned to the hotel and called one of Monica's close friends, asking her to explain what the police questions meant. But he was extremely agitated, speaking loudly and emotionally, and the woman refused to continue the conversation, believing his questions were inappropriate under the circumstances. Besides, she did not want to tarnish her friend's memory, although, in truth, she knew perfectly well about Monica's secret account, because she herself had advised her friend to create a second profile under a fake name without a photograph, one her husband would never discover. Finally, the autopsy and laboratory toxicology results arrived. Monica and Clara had indeed been poisoned, although the tests could not identify the exact substance. The Egyptian pathologist concluded that they died from dehydration after ingesting an unknown toxic substance that is absorbed into the body and leaves no trace behind. According to him, this was why conducting the autopsy quickly was so important. The inside of both stomachs reportedly looked like jelly. That was what made the poison so dangerous. The pathologist speculated that it may have been something similar to cyanide. After the autopsies, the bodies were returned home, where a Czech forensic expert conducted a second examination. Only then could the funeral take place. Peter watched the ceremony on video. Meanwhile, Hurghada police considered three possibilities. A stranger poisoned Monica, Clara, and Peter. Peter poisoned his wife and daughter, as well as himself. Peter poisoned only his wife and daughter. However, by the end of October, Egyptian authorities concluded there was no evidence of a crime. Peter received his passport back and returned home. A crowd of journalists awaited him at the airport, but Czech police intervened, intercepting Peter as he exited the plane and taking him to his parents' home. Naturally, this was only a temporary solution. Reporters hungry for sensational stories quickly figured out where Petter was staying and essentially began hunting him, waiting outside his parents' house, calling constantly, trying to extract every possible detail. The cameraman whom Peter had befriended in Egypt even messaged his mother claiming that her son had taken his own life and asked her to comment on the news. Petter likely wanted nothing more than to hide inside and never leave the house again. But he needed to work in order to repay the debts accumulated from months spent in Egyptian hotels, phone bills, and various other expenses his parents had covered. He had almost no money. The media only made things worse by reporting that although Peter Kramny had already returned home, there were still no gravestones on the graves of his wife and daughter. Desperate, Petter agreed to meet journalists at the cemetery and give an interview in exchange for money needed to pay for the headstones. According to him, he did not keep a single cent for himself, but the media framed it differently. Petter Kramny profits from photographs taken at the graves of his closest loved ones. And even when Petter gave the press no new reason for headlines, stories could simply be invented. Out of nowhere, a young woman appeared and gave an interview. Her face was hidden, and her name remained secret, but she claimed she had an intimate encounter with Petter in a car park only 6 months after his wife's death. Her story sounded more like an edited script than genuine memories, but for keeping public interest in the case alive, it worked perfectly well. Then one day, there was a knock on his apartment door. 3 police officers had arrived to arrest him on charges of double murder. Petter could not even imagine what awaited him. His only thought was that he was supposed to return to work the day after tomorrow. He genuinely believed the police would sort out the misunderstanding and release him before then. At the station, investigators asked him to take a polygraph test. He agreed immediately, convinced he had nothing to hide. But the examiner asked strange questions he never expected. For example, whether he had unplugged any electrical appliances in the Egyptian hotel room. Petter did not understand why anyone would ask such things. In reality, the turning point in the case came when Czech forensic experts concluded that Monica and Klara had died from electric shock. In one interview, Petter later admitted that he had trusted Czech doctors and police, believing they would surely determine the true cause of death of his wife and daughter. Looking back, he called that belief incredibly naive. "I should have slapped myself for being so stupid," he later said bitterly. But at the time, he remained convinced he would soon be released. So convinced, in fact, that when he first met attorney Jana Rejkova, he apologized to her and told her he would never actually need a lawyer. He was wrong about that too, because soon afterward, the trial began. From the very beginning, attorney Jana Rejkova, who took on the case, was horrified by what she considered the arrogance of Czech medical experts. According to the Egyptian pathologist, this was unquestionably a poisoning case. Yet Czech experts, she argued, acted as though their Egyptian colleagues conducted autopsies with rusty knives in the dust beside the pyramids, simply because they disliked the conclusions of the first doctor who examined the bodies. In reality, nothing could have been further from the truth. Egypt's forensic centers often employ graduates of British and American universities. In this particular case, the autopsy had been performed by a specialist educated in Britain, an experienced and highly knowledgeable practitioner. He conducted the examination according to proper procedure, and dismissing his opinion outright was, at the very least, unethical. Nevertheless, the Czech pathologist claimed to have discovered a mark on the back of Monica's neck, consistent with electrical injury. In addition, both victims reportedly showed myocardial changes which, combined with other autopsy findings, suggested that they had died from acute heart failure caused by electric shock. The pathologist did not arrive at this conclusion immediately. Instead, he claimed to have reached it through a process of elimination, ruling out every possible diagnosis until only one remained. To strengthen their argument, the experts presented 2 photographs of the hearts of Monica and Klara. Peter Kramny, lawyer, took the photographs home with her. She kept staring at them, unable to understand what exactly bothered her. Finally, she placed the 2 images together and held them up to the light, and suddenly realized the problem. Both photographs showed the exact same heart. One image had simply been edited, recolored, enlarged, and flipped, yet it was presented as if it depicted the hearts of 2 different victims. Worse still, it was unclear whose heart it actually was. Monica's, Klara's, or perhaps neither of theirs. The attorney demanded an investigation into what she considered falsification of evidence. But in order to prosecute someone, intent would have to be proven, and authorities claimed they saw no deliberate wrongdoing. The prosecutor even dismissed her concerns by saying she had become obsessed with some photographs. But these were not just photographs. They formed part of the prosecution's forensic evidence. If defense experts had manipulated evidence in the same way, they likely would have ended up in prison alongside the attorney herself. Apparently, however, the standard did not apply equally in reverse. The defense brought in 2 forensic specialists who considered death by electric shock highly unlikely. The courtroom soon became the scene of a full-scale war between experts. The only thing both sides agreed on were the names Monica and Clara. Beyond that, their conclusions completely contradicted one another. To break the deadlock, the court turned to an entire forensic institution for an independent evaluation. A higher authority, involving a larger group of specialists, would examine all the available evidence and issue its own conclusion. And then something extraordinary happened, shocking and scandalous at the same time. The media exploded with photographs of the victims lying on the autopsy table in the Egyptian morgue. Apparently, the images had been released by the Egyptian attorney who represented Cramney there. He insisted he had not been paid and only wanted to prove man's innocence, of which he himself had no doubt. The photographs caused a sensation because the alleged electrical burn mark, the very injury prosecutors constantly pointed to, was completely absent. The Egyptian pathologist who took the photos had specifically examined and photographed that area from multiple angles. There was absolutely no visible injury on the neck, and yet this mark was considered one of the key pieces of evidence supporting the theory of electrocution. So where had it come from? The mark appeared precisely where a rope had been tied around the bodies before they were transported back to the Czech Republic. Something clearly visible in video footage of the autopsy recorded on August 9, 2013. And if someone later attempted to move the body, naturally they would grab hold of the rope. Despite the publication of these highly important photographs, forensic experts still ultimately concluded that the cause of death had been electric shock. As supposedly irrefutable proof, they pointed to the victim's pallor, a condition they claim does not occur in any other traumatic death and is characteristic only of electrocution. Although the Czech investigative team sent to Egypt was never allowed to enter the hotel room or collect physical evidence, experts nevertheless concluded that electrocution could not have occurred in that room without deliberate human intervention. But the trial did not stop there. Soon, the couple's personal life became the focus of attention. The prosecution brought in a forensic psychiatrist to evaluate man's emotional state. She testified that there exists a type of man for whom murder appears easier than divorce. She described Petter as a submissive, emotionally indistinct personality with a deep dependency on others. According to her, he sought love as a form of salvation, wanting to dissolve himself entirely into his partner in hopes of solving all his problems. In the psychiatrist's view, the murders represented the culmination of a drama that had unfolded over many years. If people were shocked, she argued, it was only because the entire drama had taken place in secret, hidden from outsiders. Unfortunately, society often notices domestic abuse only once someone has been killed. Over approximately 13 years together, prosecutors managed to uncover only 2 notable conflicts between the spouses. Petter Cramney admitted that he and his wife once argued after he discovered she had been communicating online with 57 unfamiliar men. He disliked it so much that he gave her an ultimatum, either her husband or social media. Monica agreed, though, as we already know, she secretly created another account under a different name. On another occasion, the couple fought after Monica went with friends to a ladies' night event at a bar featuring male strippers who Petter had known about the event, but after seeing a photograph of his wife hugging one of the performers, he caused a major scene. According to the psychiatrist, that photograph became symbolic for Petter, proof that Monica could be happy without him. And at that moment, a panic reaction allegedly began inside him. I could be abandoned. I could lose the person I love. Sitting in the defendant's chair, Petter Cramney could not understand why the court kept discussing matters that seemed entirely unrelated to the actual case. But by the 4th day of the trial, it became clear where the prosecution was heading. One of Monica's friends took the witness stand and testified that several months before her death, Monica had begun a relationship with a man from Slovakia. The friend even claimed Monica had once described him as the love of her life. For a while, the two maintained a long-distance relationship, but eventually the communication faded away. Although the affair had technically been Monica's secret, all her close friends knew about it, and apparently saw nothing particularly shocking in her infidelity. In fact, some of Monica's friends seemed more disturbed by Mann's appearance in court. Prison, oddly enough, appeared to have improved his looks. He had lost weight, his facial features had sharpened, and he arrived in court with a hairstyle they considered inappropriate for someone in his position. The psychiatrist continued escalating the prosecution's narrative, claiming that when someone feels abandoned, they may develop a sense of having a sacred right to revenge. According to her, Petter viewed Klara as an inseparable extension of her mother, part of the betrayal inflicted upon him. The major problem for the prosecution, however, was that despite all efforts, they could not prove Monica had intended to leave her husband. On the contrary, all her friends consistently stated that she had stopped seeing her lover and had no intention of destroying her family. Furthermore, Petter Kramny adored his daughter, who was described as his little copy. Because of this, prosecutors ultimately argued that Peter had originally intended to kill all 3 members of the family, but lost his nerve and murdered only his wife and daughter. But of course, the most important question remained: how? How could he have killed both of them with electricity? The prosecution proposed 2 possible scenarios for how Peter could have done it. In the first version, the mother and daughter were standing in the shower on a wet, conductive floor. The killer would only have needed to press a live electrical cable against one of them. After both died from electrocution, Petter Kramny allegedly dried their bodies with towels, perhaps blow-dried their hair, and carried them to the beds, arranging them exactly as the witnesses, doctors, and police later found them. The second version claimed that after the mother and daughter lay down on the bed and fell asleep, Petter passed an electric current through his wife's body using, for example, an exposed electrical cord plugged into the outlet beside the bed. The current would have passed through Monica's body, killing her, and because the child was lying next to her, perhaps pressed closely against her mother, Klara died at the same moment. Afterward, according to prosecutors, Petter staged the entire scene. He moved his wife and daughter onto separate beds. He placed an overturned Coca-Cola bottle between them for added theatrical effect. He even allegedly went into the bathroom and forced himself to vomit so that doctors would believe the poisoning story during the stomach pumping. He supposedly made the room smell foul as well, because, as you may remember, the Polish neighbor later described the room as having a horrible, rotten odor. But if Petter truly did all of this to conceal a crime, it ultimately failed. The judge found him guilty of double murder. Petter Kramny was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Because he had no previous criminal record, he did not receive the full 30 years requested by prosecutors. Soon afterward, the 2 defense experts who had testified in Petter's favor also came under attack. Authorities claim their opinions were biased because their conclusions supported Mann's innocence. Yet experts are not responsible for determining guilt or innocence. They are supposed to provide professional opinions. Nevertheless, both men were sentenced to 1 year in prison, though the sentence was suspended with a 2-year probation period. They were not actually jailed, but the ruling effectively destroyed their careers. They could no longer work in the field for which they were trained and specialized. To many observers, it looked like a warning. A show trial intended to intimidate Kramny lawyer and any experts who might dare involve themselves in the case again. But Peter's attorney, Jana Rejkova, was not easily frightened. She joined forces with the organization Shalamun. Shalamun is an independent Czech organization founded in 1994 that investigates alleged miscarriages of justice, abuses of power, and procedural misconduct within the legal system, while pushing for reforms. So if the court disliked the first 2 defense experts, Shalamun found 5 more. They also uncovered additional evidence supporting Kramny case, eventually succeeding in getting a petition for retrial formally considered. Their main goal was to examine the tissue samples taken from Monica and Klara. These samples represented the only real physical evidence that could potentially reveal, or at least bring investigators closer to understanding, what had actually happened inside the Titanic Palace hotel room. Attorney Jana Rejkova appealed to both the Supreme Court and regional courts, requesting protection of this crucial evidence. She asked for the samples to be transferred to another forensic institution, explicitly citing fears that the evidence might be destroyed. She never even received a response. Shalamoon had arranged for a British forensic team to come examine the samples. The British experts had never heard of the case and therefore would not be influenced by Czech media coverage. They were supposed to study the evidence independently and provide their own conclusions. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a major tactical mistake. Once news of the British team's arrival became known, the samples were destroyed. Fortunately, local experts working with Shalamoon managed to examine them beforehand. According to their microscopic tissue analysis, the findings contradicted the theory that the victims had died from electric shock. A forensic biomechanics expert testified that if the prosecution's theory were true, namely that Monica was holding her daughter while electric current passed through her body, then severe muscle spasms would inevitably have occurred. Those spasms would have caused Monica to involuntarily squeeze Clara with enormous force, likely resulting in bruises, fractures, or even accidental strangulation. Yet no such injuries were found on either body. According to the biomechanics expert, he could not say whether Petr had killed his wife and daughter or not, but he was convinced they had not been killed by electrocution, the very crime for which Petr had been convicted. However, perhaps the prosecution's most glaring mistake involved the transcript of a phone call between Petr and his aunt while he was still in Egypt. Police officers monitoring the call transcribed one of Petr's statements as, "Everything worked out so well for me in Egypt." Only later, when members of Shalamoon reviewed the original recording, did it become clear that the transcript was inaccurate. Petr Kramny had never said those words at all. In reality, he had been talking about the travel ban preventing him from leaving Egypt, while expressing confidence that Egyptian police would sort everything out and allow him to return home soon. He said he simply believed everything would turn out fine. "I feel that everything will be okay," he had actually said. But the officer who prepared the transcript wrote something entirely different, and nothing happened to him. No punishment, no consequences. Shalamoon filed a criminal complaint alleging evidence falsification, but unsuccessfully, despite the enormous amount of work done by Jana Rejkova and Shalamoon, including new expert opinions and rebuttals of prosecution evidence. In February 2023, the regional court in Ostrava rejected Kramny's request for a retrial. Petr Kramny appealed the decision to the High Court in Olomouc. However, on August 22, 2023, during a closed session, the court dismissed the appeal and definitively upheld the earlier ruling. During the trial, nearly everyone turned away from Petr, including most of his friends and even his own sister, who testified against him in court, despite previously supporting him. Today, they no longer speak. Only his mother, stepfather, and a friend he met in prison remained on his side. Monica's parents died not long after losing their daughter. The court considered the matter settled. Petr Kramny received 28 years in prison for murdering his wife and daughter. The case was closed. But is everything really that clear-cut? Experts contradicted one another. Photographs meant to serve as evidence raised more questions than answers. Samples that might have clarified the truth were destroyed, and a key phone call turned out to have been misrepresented. So what truly happened inside that room at the Titanic Palace Hotel? Was it a carefully planned murder, or one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in recent Czech history? There is still no definitive answer. Petr Kramny does not necessarily have to be likable. He may very well be guilty of murdering his wife and daughter, whether by electrocution or by some mysterious poison. But modern society and the justice system are expected to provide more than a few speculative theories and criticism that the accused didn't look sad enough. What lingers after this case is an uncomfortable feeling that the defendant may have been condemned not only by the court, but also for the reckless decision to befriend journalists, and by the way sensationalist media chose to present the story. Every outlet told the case slightly differently, but in the overwhelming majority of instances, it became something deeply inhuman, a public spectacle and relentless harassment.